Okay, guys, and we're back with another episode of the Seth Solo Side Quest. I'm Seth from the Lonely Stoner podcast, and this is episode 49 of my side quest. Now, in this episode, we're going to be talking about former UFC welterweight champion Robbie Lawler, looking back on his career, and he recently got inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame. And we're going to look back on his career and see, does he deserve to be in the Hall of Fame? I think he does deserve to be in the Hall of Fame overall, but looking back on his record, he's got a lot of losses there, and I'm wondering, is a portion of the MMA fan base looking back on Robbie Lawler's career with maybe rose tinted glasses, and we're thinking this guy was, for lack of better terms, like Joe Rogan would say, this guy was a marauder. Was he really? He put together a few wins at times, but was just lost a lot of fights as well. Was not a guy who was walking through and dominating divisions for long periods of time at all. Obviously, in my opinion, I think he's a guy who, how can I say, sort of outdone himself, given the tools he had coming into the sport in terms of he wasn't particularly a great wrestler, had a decent takedown defense, decent power in his hands. In terms of technique, wasn't amazing, wasn't a decorated kickboxer or Muay Thai fighter, was pretty much a old school stand and bang type of fighter. And for what he was, and for his size at welterweight, he was a decent sized welterweight. Don't get it wrong, he was a 5'11" welterweight. That's a nice big size for welterweight. But we're gonna look back on his career and see, is he really as good as what we remember? Now, you look at early on in his career, the early years in UFC. I'm talking over 20 years ago. 2002 times. This guy started off with a good record, few wins. Obviously, early on in his career, lost to Nick Diaz. He's got losses to Jake Shields, losses to Renato Sobral, losses to Jacare Souza, losses to Tim Kennedy, losses to Lorenz Larkin. There's a lot of losses here against guys who he would go on to become the Robbie Lawler that we all know and love. And you're like, bro, you've got to be beating these guys. If you want to do anything in this sport, you've got to be beating these guys. And maybe this is where MMA sort of proves me wrong and where it kind of differs from boxing, because if there was a guy with these amount of losses this early on in his career is cooked. It's not done because he can get fights, but he's never been a world champion. He's never going on to main event shows. He's never going on to make serious money in the sport. Where in MMA, it's never over until it's over, right? Like I said, he had back-to-back losses to Jacare and Tim Kennedy. He then won a fight. He then lost to Lorenz Larkin. He then put 3 wins together on the bounce. Josh Koscheck, Bobby Volker, and Rory McDonald. 3 wins. He gets himself a title shot, right? So it goes to show, you're never that far away from getting a title shot. He then loses in a fight against Johnny Hendricks, which was a unanimous decision to Johnny Hendricks. He then goes on a bit of a run again. He beats Jake Ellenberger, beats Matt Brown. He then rematches Johnny Hendricks and beats him in a split decision to become the UFC welterweight champion. He then goes on to rematch Rory McDonald, beats him, and then makes his first successful title defense against Carlos Condit at the start of January 2016, at UFC 195 in a very close split decision. I remember this fight being very competitive and Carlos Condit, putting a good performance. And Robbie Lawler arguably lost that fight. I remember thinking, damn, that wasn't a super dominant win. For a guy who just went through a war against Rory McDonald, finished him in the 5th round, but went through an absolute war. Those are the sort of fights that, and I kind of even hate using this term, but they're the sort of fights that really take years off a career. They really do. And it's damaged Rory McDonald's career. We 100% saw that after that fight, Rory McDonald was never really able to reach the heights in his career again. Being at the fringe of winning a UFC welterweight championship, he was never at that level again. He's obviously gone to Bellator and PFL, and he's just sort of lost the will, not lost the will to live, but definitely lost the will to fight. I think that's definitely a safe assumption to say, and I think he's probably retired now, Rory McDonald. But yeah, back to Robbie Lawler. Robbie Lawler just about gets past Carlos Condit to make 2 successful title defenses, and then goes on to face Tyron Woodley, and Tyron Woodley knocks him TF out. Absolutely spins his jaw in the first round. Pretty much, from the start of the fight, pressures him, right overhand, puts Robbie Lawler on his ass, takes the championship. bad knockout for Robbie Lawler. A bad knockout in terms of, he was hit. Obviously, he was hit hard. He was hit really hard, put on his ass, and banged out and finished. That was really the end of Robbie Lawler's prime, if you could say. I would say it wasn't much of a prime. Looking back on it, it wasn't much of a prime because he beat Jake Ellenberger and Matt Brown. They're decent wins. Okay. You went to a decision with Matt Brown. Okay. Somewhat respectable. He then wins a split decision to win the championship, then goes through a war with Rory McDonald, and then just about gets past Carlos Condit, and then gets knocked out by Tyron Woodley. That was his world title run. It was pretty underwhelming. And then you go on to have guys like Tyron Woodley and Kamaru Usman hold on to the welterweight championship, and by comparison, Robbie Lawler had an awful title run compared to those two. Woodley and Usman were seen as, at the time, two of the most dominant welterweight champions we've ever had since GSP. Right? So yeah, Robbie Lawler loses his championship. He then has a rebound against Donald Cerrone, wins that fight. But even by that point, Donald Cerrone was done. Donald Cerrone will be another guy who we'll probably have a video about at some point. But Donald Cerrone was done at that point. To be fair, so was Robbie Lawler. But it was just the battle of who was more finished. And Robbie Lawler wins unanimous decision in that fight. And this is how we know who's absolutely finished. So after that Donald Cerrone win, Robbie Lawler goes on to lose against Rafael dos Anjos, lose against Ben Askren, lose against Colby Covington, and lose against Neil Magny. So he has 4 losses in a row. Right? 3 unanimous decisions and 1 submission against Ben Askren. The Ben Askren one was a bit sus, but he was getting outclassed by Rafael dos Anjos, in my opinion. Got absolutely outclassed. And essentially, the Rafael dos Anjos fight and the Colby Covington fight, in my opinion, were pretty similar, except Colby Covington just did what Rafael dos Anjos did, but just put in more takedowns as well. Do you know what I mean? Was quite similar. Basically similar fights, but Colby just used more wrestling. These guys were just outlanding Robbie Lawler, was using way more volume, overwhelming him, and beat him. Ben Askren one was a bit sus, obviously. We saw the bulldog choke submission, bit weird there, but that's the sport. I mean, he wasn't fighting out of it, and the ref called it. Bit of a BS win, but for Ben Askren, but whatever. And the Neil Magny fight, Neil Magny beat him in a 3-round decision in 2020, and that's really all there is to it. So that's 4 losses in a row. So he's lost the championship. He's then gone in the next 5 fights, 1-4, with his only win being against a past his prime finished Donald Cerrone. Right? And Donald Cerrone is an interesting one where you can say he was finished. I mean, you can either say he was finished or he's never really that good. Because we look back at Donald Cerrone's welterweight run, his only real good wins were against guys who were basically unranked. Obviously he had done a very good job at lightweight and got himself to a title shot, but bottled it in the title shot, then went up to welterweight, beat some unranked guys, worked his way up, then started to face more of the serious guys in the division. Even then, Robbie Lawler at that point was just coming off a bad knockout loss, and Donald Cerrone still couldn't beat him. So after Robbie Lawler loses his title, he goes 1-4, and then he goes to fight Nick Diaz, who at that point was probably the worst fighter in the UFC in terms of skill, ability, and athleticism. I mean, maybe not skill and ability, but in terms of athleticism, Nick Diaz absolutely finished. He had no reason to be in the octagon, apart from money, obviously, to be in the octagon when was this? In 2021. He's old. He's been past it, but this fight really showed us, wow, Nick is finished. Like, he should not be fighting anymore, right? And that goes to show the sort of level that Robbie Lawler was at this point. Like, the only guy he could beat was past his prime, finished guys who are basically halfway retired when they step into the octagon with you. You put up a bit of resistance against Donald Cerrone, he's probably going to fold. You put up a bit of resistance against Nick Diaz, and you can put at least something together, you're probably going to beat him. Probably going to beat him. He then fights Brian Barberina, who I've never heard of, and he gets stopped by him. Actually, I have heard of Brian Barberina, but couldn't tell you the first thing about him. and he finishes Robbie Lawler. Then Robbie Lawler has one more fight in 2023 against Nico Price and knocks him out. A great way to end a career, to be fair. I think that's probably going to be his last fight now. He's been inducted to the Hall of Fame. That's an amazing way to end your career. I'll being honest. That was a great way to end your career. But, you know, Robbie Lawler had some real shaky moments in his career, and it's leaving me thinking, was this guy really even as good as what we're making him out to be? I know Joe Rogan and the likes like to paint Robbie Lawler out to be something he's not, some warrior, some marauder. Obviously, he's a UFC fighter, UFC former welterweight champion, and has done a lot in the sport. He's a warrior to an extent, right? But he's no, you know, he's no Francis, he's no Usman, he's no GSP, he's not even any Colby Covington. In terms of skill, Colby Covington, I mean, he did walk through Robbie Lawler, but even in his prime, a prime Colby Covington via prime Robbie Lawler, prime Colby Covington wins that. And Colby Covington never became champion. So it does kind of speak to, you need to be what era you're in as well. Obviously, Robbie Lawler won the championship post GSP. He won the championship post GSP and post Johnny Hendricks in USADA era. And when he beat Johnny Hendricks for the title, it was a split decision. Arguably, I mean, those guys could have had a third fight. I'm surprised that didn't happen. I mean, I know why it didn't happen, because Johnny Hendricks fell off because of USADA. He fell off and then went up to middleweight and, you know, absolutely was cooked. Absolutely cooked. But, I mean, that's why I didn't have the trilogy. But, again, yeah, a weird one. I think Robbie Lawler obviously has the two successful title defences against Rory McDonald and Carlos Condit. That's nothing to be scoffed at. Of course, the Carlos Condit fight was close. The Rory McDonald fight was close until he stopped him in the 5th round, which goes down as one of my favourite fights ever, and I'm sure for a lot of you will go down similarly as one of your favourite fights ever, with, you know, such a war. But outside of that, Robbie Lawler didn't accomplish a huge amount in his career. He wasn't a highly decorated, like I said, he wasn't a highly decorated kickboxer. He had some big power for the welterweight division and got stoppages, to be fair, so respect him for that. But wasn't a great wrestler, was able to stuff takedowns. Guys wouldn't really be able to hold down Robbie Lawler for the most part. We saw throughout his UFC career. We never really saw him go for takedowns. Like I said, he was mostly an old school stand and bang style fighter. And to be fair, after he lost the title, he went 1-4. So maybe there's a reason why we don't see that style of fighter in the UFC too much anymore. But yeah, Robbie Lawler, in my opinion, does deserve to be in the UFC Hall of Fame, but his career wasn't always cracked up to be. But yeah, that's been it from me. Another episode of the Seth Solo Side Quest in the bag, episode 49, and I'm out. Peace.